This is getting started with SQLite. In this screencast, I'm going to go through the first few things that you need to know to be able to work with SQLite. We're going to be exploring the SQLite 3 command line utility. And with this utility, I'm going to show you how to get into the utility, get out of the utility, create a table, insert data into a table, and query data out of the table. This won't be comprehensive. We're just going to be doing the first couple, 3 or 4 features of SQLite 3 that you need to be able to get productive with the tool. And this will serve as a foundation for the other things that we need to do throughout the rest of the SQLite course. Okay, so my first step is to launch the terminal application. I'm on a Macintosh here, so the process is going to be different if you're on Windows. We included some notes in the course material as to how to go about that if you're on Windows, but if you're on the Mac, your first step is to open a Finder window, go into Applications, and then in the Applications window there is a folder called Utilities. Inside the utilities folder is a bunch of system utilities and some other junk. Terminal is what you want there, so you go ahead and double click on that. And after a second or two, terminal will launch, and you'll have a lovely command line interface that you can use to get access to the functionality in SQLite 3. Now, one of the other things that I'm going to do here, which is just a little convenience, is I'm going to change into the desktop directory so that any files that are created will be placed on my desktop, and it'll be easy for me to see them and to move them around and things like that. I have a bunch of junk on my desktop right now, but you just can't see it because I turned it off for the purposes of the screencast, but you'll be able to see if I do a listing of stuff that's in here. I have an old version of the my database here, and I'll actually remove that because I'm going to create it again for you so you can see what I'm doing here. And if I do a star.db, there's no database on here at the moment. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to start the SQLite 3 command line utility, just as you saw in the course materials. I'm going to create a table called people, again, just like we did in the course materials. I'm going to insert a row into this. I'm going to query information out of that, and then I'm going to fiddle around with some of the settings in SQLite 3 so you can see the differences between the sort of default way that SQLite 3 operates and the way that I like to have it configured. But this is going to be very basic, very simple, and we're going to do some more things that will build on this a little bit later. So for now, SQLite 3. Oh, and I should also mention too that this, where we are right now, assumes that you've already installed SQLite 3 on your machine. I don't like to do screencasts that involve installation steps because for the most part, number one, they're going to be different for every operating system, and number two, a large number of you, especially if you're using Macs, will either have SQLite installed already, or you'll just be running a Windows installer executable, and so there's really nothing for me to teach. Just download it, install it, and at this point, we'll assume that you already have it installed. Okay, so when I type in SQLite 3 followed by the name of a database, my.db, SQLite 3 will check to see if that database already exists, and if it does exist, it will load it, and if it doesn't exist, it will create it. This is convenient because it's easy to get started creating a database, but it's also tricky too because you have to make sure that you spell the name of the database correctly, and if you don't spell the name of the database correctly, then you will end up creating a new database, maybe unexpectedly, and then you'll panic as you try and see where your data went and where your tables went, and the answer is that, whoops, you forgot to spell the database name correctly. So one of the things that I like to do as a result of that is to create databases with short, easy to spell file names like my.db. Okay, so after I hit enter there, I am now in the SQLite 3 command line utility. It tells me the version of SQLite. It reminds me that I can type .help for instructions on various commands. And it also reminds me, which is helpful, that any SQL statement that I type in must be terminated with a semicolon. This is a common error. If you forget, it'll also remind you as you're working with it, but it's just something to get into the habit of doing. If you're coming from another relational database system like MySQL, this will probably be second nature to you. If you are using a database system that doesn't require terminating semicolons like SQL Server, then this is something you'll have to get used to. It's just something that you've got to do. Okay, so step one, let's actually take a look to see the contents of this database. We know it's empty because we just created it, but just for laughs, I'm going to use the .command tables. And you can see that there are no tables in this database. So let's create one. I'm going to say create table people, and I'll go first underscore name, and that'll be a text field, and then last underscore name is also going to be a text field. Now, I'm using the SQL conventions for capitalization. And in SQL, the convention is that when you're using an SQL keyword like create table or a data type or anything like that, you capitalize it. It's not required that you do this, but I like to do it. I don't know if it's just that I'm old school or that I like the fact that the keywords kind of pop out at you. It just makes it easier for me to parse, and I've been doing it forever. Maybe this is cargo cult thinking, but you don't have to if you don't feel like it. So I'm a fast typist too, so it's no big deal for me to get into caps lock mode here. So now let's see what we're looking at here. Did the table get created? And yes, it did. If I type in .tables, that gives me the list of all the tables that are in the database. There is one table in there called people, and that's beautiful. So now the next step will be to add data with an insert into. And as we pointed out in the text, oh, and I blew it here. I think this will actually work, but I'm going to do it the right way, the way that I explained it in the text, because I want to be a good person, right? Let's start this all over. We're going to go insert into people. Ignore what I just did. Don't do it that way. Do it this way. We go fields and then values. There we go. And my name is too long, so we're going to wrap around here, but hopefully that'll work for you. Actually, I can widen this a little bit, and it should be okay. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so at this point I have inserted a row into the people table. And you can see that I specified first name and last name as my fields. Now, if I wanted to insert someone, let's say I didn't know their last name, I could just go first underscore name. Whoops, what did I do there? Hang on a second. Insert into people, and I'm just going to go first name only, and then I'm going to go values. Betty, right? I don't know Betty's last name. So that worked, right? I can insert data as long as the field has been defined to accept null values. We're going to talk more about null values later in the course, but I wanted to touch on that as a little extra topic for the video because it is possible for you to do inserts even though you don't have all of the information. This is legal. You can also set up the table so that the table will refuse to accept values that are null. In other words, the rule could be that if you don't know the person's last name, we cannot accept them into the database. And this helps you enforce business rules and consistency in your data, that sort of thing. Let's see what this looks like by doing a select. I can go select first name, comma, last name from people. And you can see what this looks like. Now, it's kind of interesting because I've got all of the default settings of SQLite 3 here, which if you've ever worked with a command line database utility, you may not get what you're expecting here. You can see that all of the data that is in this table comes back, but the amount of adornment that you might expect here, like the names of columns and the word null in exchange for the actual null value, is not being displayed, right? So, but you can see that there are two fields that came back in the query as expected, right? And I have two rows of data that I have stored or that I had previously inserted into the people table, and so also as expected those both came back. The second row, where there was no last name, came back, and obviously no last name was displayed. Let's go ahead and turn on some of these SQLite 3 options so that you can see a little bit better what we're dealing with here. The first thing we'll do is we'll turn on headers. And then I'm going to hit the up arrow twice here and rerun this query. The up arrow scrolls through the history of the things that you've entered in at the command line, and it's just a handy convenience. It prevents you from having to type the same thing in over and over again. So now you can see that the output is a little bit modified here. You can see that first name and last name are the two columns that came back, and all the data came back so I know what the names of the columns are, which is handy, especially if this wasn't my database. Like if I didn't just set this database up, it's really handy for me to be able to have these features that give me the ability to see what the names of everything is and so forth. So one other handy switch that you can turn on here, which is mode column. And I'll do the query again so you can see what it looks like with mode column on. Now things are pretty nicely formatted. There's a little bit more error in between, there's a space between each column, and you can see that there's a nice little dashed line. It's really nice to be able to have the data line up like that, and it's very handy to be able to kind of see everything arranged that way. One last thing that I'll mention that isn't in the text is that you have the ability also to output the query as HTML, which is an interesting feature, and I don't know of any other database system command line tool that has this. But if I go mode HTML and then do the query again, it's going to output this as rows in an HTML table. So you could, in theory, copy and paste this into an HTML table and somewhat easily publish it to the web, although it would be probably easier for you to write a little Python script to publish this to the web if the web was the ultimate destination of this data. This is just kind of a little handy thing that the designers of SQLite 3 threw in there to be able to facilitate the creation of these kinds of published outputs here. But if you want to go back to mode column and then we go select like that, you can see that it's a little bit cleaner. It's sort of stacked up neatly, and it's a little bit easier to see. There are a few more options in SQLite 3 that are covered in the text. I won't go into them in the video. Really, my goal here was just create table, insert data, select data, and that's it. We'll save the rest for another video. To get out of SQLite, you just type .quit, and you're back at your normal command prompt, and your database is closed.